So Elwood, it's a great pleasure for me to have a chance to chat with you today. I thought that maybe we would get started by telling us, if you could tell us how things were in terms of hormone action, what people were thinking about estrogen and other hormones as to how they worked and the problems that were being addressed and your point of view towards them.
Well, in the 1950s, that was the big era of enzymes. Biochemistry was largely endocrinology. Began the transcription, RNA synthesis, and that didn't come in for another 10 years. So the current thinking about steroid hormones, estradiol, the principal one, was that it had to be reacting with enzymes. And the conventional model that they had is that the 17-hydroxy group of estradiol was oxidized by enzymatic oxidation using one coenzyme, and then that was oxidized to a ketone group, to estrone, and then it was reduced by the oxidized form of another coenzyme, thereby translocating a reduced hydrogen from one to form reduced form of what was then called NADP, and that was known to be an important factor in many biosynthetic reactions. And coming into the field and having joined that Department of Surgery at the University of Chicago, and Dr. Huggins, who had formed that in the middle 60s, and brought in two or three young people to join it. Well, he was a urologist, won the Nobel Prize for work on prostate cancer, but he was interested in breast cancer and estrogens too, and he showed me how very tiny amounts of estradiol in say a test animal such as the rat, you could make the female reproductive tract grow to 6 times or so its size in the immature animal or the castrate animal. And then everybody thought it had to be enzymes. But so that fascinated me. How could such a tiny amount of an organic compound cause such a remarkable growth response? And this, as I said, the prevailing theory then that was that it was oxidized by one coenzyme, reduced by another. But then, on the other hand, you had a synthetic estrogen, ethylstilbestrol, which could not be oxidized. It had no aliphatic hydroxyl groups. That's a perfectly good enzyme, a perfectly good hormone. So we thought, well, maybe we should attack this from a different angle. Now, the little background for all of this was my experience there in 1947 in Zurich, learning about steroid chemistry with Professor Ruzicka, who won the Nobel Prize and was head of the biochemistry there in the so-called ETH, the Technische Hochschule in Zurich. While I was there, I promised my late wife of 41 years that I would not try to climb any mountains because I had no experience. Mm-hmm. So when we came to Switzerland, one saw the Matterhorn standing all alone. Most peaks are just a little bit out of elevation in a ridge of a mountain, but Matterhorn stands all by itself, regally there, with the northeast facing Switzerland, and looking like a sheer wall of rock. And it was the last mountain in Europe, the major mountain to be climbed. And so when I saw it, and I was approached by a student from Colorado, a young man who was getting his PhD there in Zurich, and he was an expert climber. He had lined up a guide to accompany him, and you're allowed to have 2 guides to a climber now. Used to be you didn't have, and in the first climb, finally, when someone climbed the Matterhorn, 4 out of 7 people were killed. So the law requires no more than 2 climbers to a guide. So they wanted someone else to share the cost of the guide. So I was in good physical shape from tennis and boxing and judo. So I was fascinated by the mountain. So my wife released me from my promise, and we started out at 6 o'clock in the morning to get to the top before the sun melted snow and made landslides. And it was the hardest physical thing I ever did in my life, because I was had no experience, although I was in good physical shape, but the atmosphere was rather oxygen free up there. And so we got to the top about 8 in the morning, and starting out early when it was still dark, and I was going to stay. I all set to stay up there for a while. No one's there, and after half an hour, guide said, "No, we have to start back." And I'm glad we did, because on the way down, where we'd been about an hour before, there was a landslide, and 2 days later, 2 people were killed in such a landslide. So, with a long-winded background here, this idea of, excuse me, I got ahead of myself a little bit. So that was the, when we got back, I started reading a little bit the history of the Matterhorn, and I learned that it was the last mountain to be climbed. And I wondered, how it could be the last mountain to be climbed if even a novice could do it with the help of a guide. And everybody tried to go up the Italian side, which the Italian border goes right over the top of the Matterhorn, the Swiss on one side, Italy on one, and the French border coming in almost there. So it's right at the corner of 3 countries. And everybody tried to come up from the Italian side, because that looks more gradual than that. It turns out there's one place in there which was not, only a very few experts have ever made it up there, and people hadn't, it was, as I said, the last one to be climbed. And an English engraver named Edward Whymper, who had tried the Italian side a couple times, his hobby was mountain climbing, failed. He came with binoculars and studied the northeast face of the Matterhorn, the different faces, and said maybe it isn't as difficult as one thinks. So they started out to try the northeast face, which looks like a sheer wall of rock, but there are crevasses and things in there. And they made the first climb, 1865 this actually was, and that was the first climb of the Matterhorn. On the descent, he went up with 6 colleagues, all roped together. On the descent, a rope broke between number 3 and 4, and 4, 5, 6, and 7 fell to their deaths. And so now you can have 2 people to a guide. Well, anyway, this idea of alternative approach, try to do it differently than people are the conventional way that didn't seem to be working. So when we looked at the estradiol making the uterus grow this way, and everybody thought that it was being oxidized and reduced, but no one could really prove it well. And it didn't explain diethylstilbestrol, so we decided to take an alternative approach. That my graduate student, Herbert Jacobson, now a professor at Albany Medical School, and we decided to try to determine not what hormone does to the tissue, which everybody was looking at, what results from giving the hormone, what about the enzyme, whatever, but what happens to the hormone itself? Well, the reason probably people hadn't tried this so much is that it's very low doses, I mentioned, that to find the actual physiological dose, and to give a hyperphysiological dose wouldn't really be significant. So luckily we were at the University of Chicago then, and Fermi Lab, where the plutonium project was developed and everything, had the facilities to handle carrier-free tritium. If you tried to bring that on campus, they wouldn't allow it, but we were able to go out to Fermi Lab and take 60-hydroestradiol, developed an apparatus that we could measure the uptake of tritium by a catalytic reduction to double bond. And so we wanted to be sure that it was complete, because we thought maybe there'd be an adverse catalytic effect of the higher isotope, tritium 3 times as heavy as hydrogen. Actually, it went a little bit faster with tritium than with hydrogen itself. So with this apparatus, we were able to reduce, get 60-hydroestradiol, where we could actually detect a billionth of a gram. So a trillionth of a gram. And really, you need about a billionth of a gram to be able to study it well. We could find a trillionth of a gram, so we came back and administered this to immature rats or castrate rats, and find out, to our surprise, nothing happens to it. It is not changed chemically.
So I think that you started the synthesis with 30 curies of carrier-free tritium. Is that right?
Well, about 60, I think, was what it took in our apparatus. We'd use up a bit of all of that, and then pump the rest back again for the next time.
It's not millicuries, curies, 60
curies, yeah. So they had the facilities for that at the Fermi Lab, and I should, as a side effect, I should say that later at Chicago, I had the pleasure of living next door to the Fermis for a couple of years and going to their daughter's wedding. Wonderful gentleman, and deserving of all the plutonium work that he did. So in any case, we had what we could do is to find what happened to the hormone in the tissue, the answer being nothing, but it did bind to a hitherto unrecognized protein there that and cause it, extranuclear protein in the target tissues, cause it to move to the nucleus and act as a transcription factor for specific synthesis of specific RNAs. But biochemists didn't like that. They said, where were the enzymes? And how dare you call it a receptor when it isn't even in a membrane? People thought receptors were in membranes. But about 6 years later, Bert O'Malley down in Houston actually got interested in this and tried the similar experiments with progesterone, and found out that its target tissues had a receptor protein, which the hormone caused to move to the nucleus and synthesize specific RNAs. And about the same time, Ron Evans and John Baxter, a little bit later, showed with thyroid hormone a similar receptor protein being caused by binding to the hormone to move to the nucleus and act as a transcription factor. So then about 1 year later, about 10 years after our first report, at a meeting in Vienna where only 5 people were present, because everybody was there to learn how estradiol worked in a different, our session conflicted with a plenary session where 1,000 people were to hear how estradiol, now we know, doesn't work, and 3 of whom were other speakers, were there to learn how now about estrogen receptor. So that's the background of estrogen receptor, and it stuck in my mind this idea of an alternative approach to, if it isn't working by conventional methods, try something differently.
Take an alternative approach. Yeah, just like
an alternative approach, yeah. And that that founded the field of nuclear receptors, as it's known, estrogen being the first, progesterone the second. Now there are about 49 was the last figure I've seen of biochemical regulators that all follow the same pattern, so it did pay off.
Right, 49 in mice, but humans only have 48. Mice have one extra.
Well, anyway, then we had other challenges then. One had the receptor protein, one tried to make antibodies to it, so one could use immunochemical methods to study the receptor and measure it a lot more better than the binding technique, and without any success. And people also had actually proposed, these are immunochemists try this, and it was proposed maybe estradiol is so ubiquitous hormone. It binds to its receptor, and the receptor is not recognized as a foreign protein because it's present to some extent in so many tissues. So, but to us then, coming in with a little background in alternative approach and what the tissue did to the hormone, we decided we would use an unconventional method and use, we thought if we had the receptor protein and added what we thought might be the antibody preparation from the immune response, and then we had the radioactive hormone bound to the receptor as a marker. If they had an antibody, it would make it move faster than, because the antibody being about the same size as a receptor protein.
So this was in a sucrose gradient?
Yeah, sucrose gradient and an ultracentrifuge. And it worked just like a charm. We could show that you could detect the antibodies there. You could see the different antibodies could react, different preparations of antibody could react to different places in the receptor protein, because if you could saturate it with one, you could add the second antibody, and then you would get a further movement on the gradient. So we were able to get the first antibodies to steroid hormone receptor and use those then to measure the receptor, study it, and determine its amount in biological methods, including those from humans. And that's the third alternative approach we had then, was for studying the response of breast cancer to hormonal type of therapy. And so it was known that so there was some connection as far as early as the 1890s from Sir George Beatson took the ovaries out of he was struck by the fact that breast cancer patients with large tumors, because then they didn't find it as early enough and you had very large tumors, that if there must be, during the menopause, they would have the tumor would grow and then retract again. So there must be some connection between the ovary and the breast cancer. They didn't know about steroid hormones, of course, till about 1920. So back in the late 1990s, the idea of some connection between the ovary and breast cancer was established by Beatson, who was knighted for this, Sir George Beatson then. So there's a number of places that have Beatson Institutes. So anyway, people then tried taking out the ovaries for breast cancer, and the younger woman taking them out in older women, taking out the adrenal glands in the older woman, because that's the source of estrogens after menopause, or taking out then the pituitary gland, which controls all of these hormone factories. And the only problem is only about 1/3 or a little bit less of 1/3 of the patients will respond to this kind of therapy, and you're taking out these tissues, organs for out of 7 patients, and about 3 would respond. And all that time, that when they didn't respond, you'd have to take about 8 months to see if they did. The cancer would be growing and growing all the time. So one had to have some idea to identify which are the ones that are going to respond, because then the ones that aren't going to respond, if you predict this, then you could use chemotherapy right away when the hormone is still much smaller. So we decided, as an alternative approach, let's measure the receptor content of the hormone, of the breast tumors, of patients who are going to undergo adrenalectomy or hypophysectomy or ovarectomy in the younger patient, and see if there's any correlation there. And it was, again, quite clear that by this approach you could see that those that had escaped from the hormone dependency of the original breast tissue, they didn't need the hormone anymore, so they didn't make the receptor, and they did not respond to taking away the receptor because they didn't need it anymore. They had gotten an escape. But those that responded, they still had the hormone because the hormone was making them grow, and taking it away, they went away. So this gives you a good way to predict which hormone should have adrenalectomy or hypophysectomy, and which should be put on chemotherapy right away before the tumor had a chance to grow anymore after it was first detected by. And
this led to tamoxifen, right?
And this was, this was taking out the tissues.
Right, that was before, right?
Yeah. And then there were some anti-estrogens that were known, tamoxifen being one of them, but not much study was done. But then a man named Craig Jordan and he was at Northwestern University at that time, before he went to New York, and we thought, well, maybe we could try and see if tamoxifen wouldn't do the same thing as taking out the tissue, taking out the hormone producing tissue. And sure enough, there was a pretty good correlation between those the amount of receptor that was there and their response. So just as it was by taking out the hormone, you didn't have to do that. You just give them the anti-estrogen tamoxifen. And Craig and I used to delight the audiences, and when we would give talks, and by a little jingle with saying, a lady with growth neoplastic thought castration was just a bit drastic. She preferred that her ill could be cured with a pill. Today it's no longer fantastic. Anyway, that's the background of tamoxifen, and that does put it may prevent the estrogen from acting. Then along came other people studying this and found that by getting something that would prevent the synthesis of the estrogen in the first place, rather than its action on the tissue, might have some effect. And along came the so-called aromatase inhibitors, preventing the synthesis of the hormone, putting the factory out of business, rather than the action of the product at the target level. So today, some patients do better on tamoxifen, some do better on Arimidex, but most of them do a little better on Arimidex, and people are taking it over more and more there.
I think so.
My wife, who you just met, is a hormone responder. She had her breast cancer removed, and it was receptor positive. Every breast cancer now has hormone receptor, estrogen receptor, determined on it. And she had it. It was determined. It was hormone receptor positive, and they then gave her. And they took it off by the mammogram, but to make sure if there are any metastases that were already there when they took out the primary tumor, they put these on Aromadex. So she's finishing her fifth year of Aromadex now, finishing her fourth, and her hormone the receptor is gone. So this is, in a way, an alternative approach to do with a pill instead of what put the surgeon out of business and use a chemical to inhibit the action of estrogen by keeping estrogen from being there to act. So this then was what I like to say was made one, especially when my wife was benefited from it, was made one feel good. And it did bring joy to my heart in Shanghai when the 50th anniversary of our presentation in Vienna, where 5 people were present, you know. The 50th anniversary of that was 2008, and Shanghai had a celebration of this as a surprise for me. They did not tell me. They asked me please to come and give a lecture and bring your slides along and bring some photos along if you can too, and a CV. And so when I got there, here was this beautiful brochure dedicated to the 50th anniversary here. And on this one, they had the figure that it said 100,000 ladies every year are prevented from dying due to our work, so that made me feel especially good.
I would think so. That's spectacular, really.
Especially when my wife had the same.
Yes,
so this was 52 years now, and I think a lot's been learned since then, but we do still have a problem with cancer, but early detection is important. But on many of the patients, we can do well with hormonal therapy. Unfortunately, those that have escaped the chemotherapy, we're getting better agents too in chemotherapy, but those remissions are not quite as good, and the chemotherapeutic agents are pretty toxic.
So I think that you and Sohaib are doing some more on tamoxifen now, right?
Right, and that's one of the things that we're studying right now since I came here for. He's the one that came to when I had retired from Chicago, because they had retirement age back when I reached 70. That went out when I was 73, but when I was 70, you had to retire at age 70. And of course, today that isn't as old as it was 30 years ago.
Right.
So anyway, I had to retire, and we spent a year in my present wife in New York at Memorial Sloan Kettering, which is interesting. I couldn't have lived 35 years like I did in Chicago, in New York, I think. But it was interesting for a year, being right there with Memorial Sloan Kettering and Rockefeller University, right on the corner there in Manhattan. And then they got a job in Hamburg ready for me, Albert Albert Humboldt Foundation set up a professorship for me to go to Hamburg for a while, and I spent then about 7.5 years in Hamburg, and then I was going to retire, but they wanted me to come to the Karolinska for a year because Jan-Åke Gustafsson from Houston had discovered a second estrogen receptor, namely now the ER beta as it's called, and what we had is ER alpha. So ER beta and ER alpha, they were studying quite a lot there, and I went there for a year and ended up spending 3 years and had about 4 publications with Jan-Åke on ER beta. And knowing both the two different ER receptors, you can get a better picture than you could with one receptor alone. So it all adds up. You do it. Then when I was in, that's in Stockholm, Soeb Khan came up was in Stockholm for some other reason. He came over and said, when you get back, won't you come to Cincinnati for a while? And that was very tempting because I grew up in Springfield, Ohio, after having been born in North Dakota, but moved to Springfield when I was 4. And grew up there in Cincinnati was the big city. I knew it pretty well, coming down to watch the Reds play baseball or come to the opera, symphony. And so I took tennis lessons at the Camargo Country Club in college, and in high school actually at the Hyde Park Country Club. So I was tempted. I said, I'll come for 7 months. And I'm here 8 years now and not smart enough to know when to leave. But in any case, that's a little bit of how I got here and how I got to interact with other people like Anoke Gustafson, who is another Texan that's done well, and who had to retire at age 65 in Stockholm. And I tried to get him to come here to the University of Cincinnati, and he was going to think about coming here, but somehow our administration got it mixed up and thought that he had to come right away or they couldn't have him, so that we weren't ready to have him right away. No, he had until another 3/4 of a year, and so they told him no. And then when we found out that he could come, they already had someone else. So Janoke had already decided to come to Texas, so he's happy there.
He seems to be happy. Yes, we're happy to have.
That's a little background of the whole history of estrogens, estrogen receptor, and breast cancer. And it's still a lot of women are not found early enough or do not get the proper therapy, but more and more they are doing this, and many are alive today. It would not have been even 10 years ago.
It's really spectacular. So I think that the readers and the viewers of the website at Annual Reviews of Physiology will be thrilled to have had this opportunity to hear your stories. Do you have any other stories for them? Any other things that you'd like to pass along?
Well, let me think.
I'm thinking about boxing.
About what?
About boxing. When you were much younger, of course, you, I understand, were in the Gold Gloves.
Oh, yeah. Well, my mother was a grade school teacher up in. I was in Minnesota until I was 4, after being born in North Dakota, and so she taught me to read and write when I was 4, and when I came to start school in Springfield, the first year, that's what you learned, is how to read and write. So they put me ahead right away, and to the end of the second year, it's a year and a half ahead of time, and that made me much younger than everybody else, and I was kind of tall and skinny, and socially immature. So this was a handicap anyway. So trying to think, how did I get started on boxing? Anyway, I guess it was
at Wittenberg?
It must have been when I was in Wittenberg, and they had an intramural boxing tournament there. That was how it was. And being tall and skinny gave you an advantage. I fought in a 140-pound class, the 45-pound class of welterweight, and that gave me an advantage of reach on some of the more stocky individuals. So in Memorial Hall in Springfield, they would have each spring, about 3 or 4 weeks in a row, they would have what's called the Golden Gloves for 3 counties, not only Springfield, Ohio, but they had a big, what's called then a CCC camp that had a lot of pretty rough people working during the Depression, this was. And so they had people coming up in Memorial Hall every Friday night for a while. So I do remember that first Friday night, here I came out, this skinny young Norwegian Dane from North Dakota originally, and the fellow, he dropped his guard a little bit, and I caught him right on the chin, and he went down for the count, and raised my hand there with all this, I guess 3,000 people out there Friday night, and that sort of changed things. The next Friday night I came up against another pretty tough looking guy, but he raised his guard a bit, and I caught him in his solar plexus. He went down to the count. So 2 knockouts in a row, and actually my late wife Mary, whose father was sort of a boxing fan, she was in the audience there in Memorial Hall. I didn't know her, of course, at that time. She was somewhat older, 5 years older than I, but she was there to see me win. And in the finals of the 3-county tournament, I somewhat fortunately, I think, came down with the flu epidemic of 1939. They did have a flu epidemic then, you're too young to remember it. And I recovered enough to go down and fight, but I did not recover enough to, I lost the decision, and my opponent went on and won and he was really quite good. He went on, won the state and the national, turned professional.
Wow.
So anyway, it was this boxing that you reminded me of that helped me a lot with self-confidence that I had because of being younger than other people. So I had a good career at Wittenberg. I had no problem winning the intramural boxing there, and I played on the tennis team there, and so I did enjoy Wittenberg, and was president of my fraternity there, and so it all kind of, a lot of it went back to the boxing, and all of
it all worked out very well.
It all worked out very well, right.
Well, thank you, Elwood.
You're welcome.
I really enjoyed talking with you, and I hope that you have many more years of success as things continue to move forward.